Hi everyone, I've decided to broadcast from the exotic location of my kitchen today. All sorts of fun things happen. You can see this is where I sit and I do my work. And I look at my window here, and can you see that? I watch my birds. Are there any birds there? Not yet. Sometimes there's dudes walking down the street. It's great. My dog, she's over there in the corner. Where is she? Oh, there she is. One of them. Ada, don't look. Don't look. She has allergies though, so she licks her paws too much. I actually have allergies today too, so you'll have to excuse me if I'm like kind of snarfing a little bit. Anyway, let's get down to business. So today we're going to be talking about social network sites, and this is a really, really difficult lecture to give because if we were doing this in maybe a non-offline course where we had several weeks, maybe a non-summer course where we had several weeks to talk about social network sites, I mean, we could literally go over any topic you can imagine, because basically any topic that applies to social networks that are offline, I would argue probably applies to social networks online, which actually that's a good place to start. What is a social network site? Is it something new? Well, technically, yeah, the site is new, right? The idea that we have these sites is only something that's come up in the past 10 years. And holy cow, it's almost been about 10 years, right? Since people first got their first MySpace account. I don't know if anybody was on Friendster, but I do think Facebook first became open to the public in 2006, but so we're almost there. But I do think it's an important thing to understand, and when I've taught this class in the past, I made them watch a video about this, but that even if we don't have social network sites, we always have social networks. We've always lived in social networks, and there's always been a whole study of how we group together as people, and this person's connected to that person, who's connected to that person, and what do our social networks mean for things like our health, or how different trends diffuse throughout society, right? So we've always had a social network. Social network could be friends, family, anybody who's sort of in your connected space, right? Your connected social space. Like think about it like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. Okay, sort of, but 6 degrees of influence, or all of those would be studies of an offline social network that's always existed. What social network sites do is they make that visible, right? And I assigned that first reading that it's like a long reading, and I'm like, just read the first page. Because I do like what the authors say about the definition that we've been using for social network sites, which you'll also get a taste of that in the Marwick and Ellison article. There's this long-running definition of social network sites by Dana Boyd that essentially defines these different features of them. One is that people create profiles fine. Obviously, they can make connections, because the whole point is now these connections are visible. So now it's not just like, oh, I'm aware that I have this person in my social network. It's like there's a site where I can see them. And not only can I see them, but I can see their other connections. So if I wanted, I could make a connection with other people who I know. I can make connections with them. I mean, this is why, you know, if you think about it, LinkedIn is such a handy networking tool, right? Because it allows you to sort of see connections in maybe different industries or jobs that you had always had, but weren't aware of until it was visible, right? What's interesting about this is Rains and Bruner, right, would actually say that LinkedIn might not count as a social network site. And that's actually up for debate. Maybe we can talk about it on the discussion boards a little bit. Because they say that's a nice little definition of social network sites. That's great, but it's a little too broad, because if you use that definition, then technically even YouTube counts as a social network site, which is true. I mean, you know, you go on YouTube, people have profiles, and you can definitely see, you know, other people who you can follow, and they can follow your work, and then you can go and you can see who they follow, et cetera, et cetera. So technically it is, but YouTube functions very differently than things like Facebook. I think this is what they're arguing. And in that sense, I would have to agree with them. So they added this stipulation that a social network site is really something that would be used primarily for interpersonal communication, and I think that's a good way of looking at it. So again, LinkedIn's kind of iffy, right? Because you are definitely trying to make connections with people, but I don't know if you're using it for interpersonal communication in the same way that you would use Facebook. I do disagree, though, or actually I don't know how I feel about it. You know, they talk about, well, this wouldn't count Twitter either, because they said social network sites aren't just about user-generated content. They are different from things like microblogs, which would be really a platform that's just there for you to create your own comments on things or share news content like Twitter. But I'm also thinking, I don't know, I feel like so much interpersonal communication happens with that user-generated content. I'm not sure how that really goes, but yeah. YouTube, I could definitely kind of see their argument there. Anyway, it's an interesting conversation, and if you want to understand why it's important, read the rest of their article, because it is really important for how we research these things and how we get an understanding for what social network sites do. We need to come up with sort of a shared, concrete definition of what they are. Now, I will say this is kind of a pet peeve of mine, and I did also get this from Dana Boyd. I don't call them, and she doesn't call them, social networking sites, because she would also argue that that implies that the primary purpose of a social network site is to network with people. Meaning, even if you can, that's what people would be doing with it. So I would argue that, yeah, LinkedIn would be a networking site. But people don't usually do that on sites like Facebook, right? Twitter maybe is sort of like in this iffy gray area again. The whole point is like you're not really trying to meet new people. A lot of times social network sites are really just allowing you to sort of interact with your existing network, not really network with new people. So definitely a very nuanced distinction, but I think it's an important one. Okay, so as I mentioned before, there could be all different types of things that social network sites have changed or introduced. We could talk for days about it, but I just picked out a couple. The first thing I really want you to know, and it comes up in a couple of the things I assigned, is what context collapse is, because I think that's one of the biggest deals with any type of social network site, regardless of how you define it. What is context collapse? Well, there's actually an NPR interview that I assigned with Dana Boyd where she explains it, and they talk about it in that article that talks about mourning on social network sites. But in a nutshell, context collapse is when all of a sudden you don't really have the nice, neat social categories, you know, that make it easy to sort of separate the different parts of your life anymore. I know that wasn't the best explanation. Okay, think about it like this. This is a classic example that they always use, which is that, you know, one of the reasons that weddings can be a little bit awkward is because for those of you who have gotten married, or those of you who will, you'll understand this, you know that it's like, great, I can't wait to share this day with my friends and my family and my grandparents, my extended family, and that random cousin that I've had, and maybe some coworkers, right? What makes that kind of an awkward situation is that as far as your impression management goes, as far as how you present yourself, it becomes much more complicated when there are all these different people from different parts of your life that you have to sort of manage your impression in front of. So maybe you act a little bit differently in front of your friends than you do in front of your family. Maybe you act a little bit different in front of your professors than you do in front of your family, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what happens though when you get all those people in one room? It could be very awkward, especially if, let's say, one group knows something about you that another group doesn't, et cetera, et cetera. So usually, you know, in offline worlds, that used to be confined to only weddings and funerals, which they bring up in the Facebook morning article that I assigned. Funerals are another place where it's very easy to see that social context collapse. But social network sites, I would argue, have made it very, very common. And this affects how we have to think about our identity, how we have to think about our audiences. All of a sudden, it's not so easy to keep all of these different components of our social network separate because everybody's there on this platform where the entire social network is visible. And that means that not only do you have to think about, for instance, how you're going to present yourself to all of these different groups, but it also affects, right, the different groups that can come in contact with each other, right? So you have to be a little bit more savvy about thinking about the ways that you sort of manage those connections. And sometimes, right, people try to manage context collapse on social network sites by making different privacy lists and everything. There is sort of a rebellion against that. I've always thought that would be very difficult. I've had a lot of students that told me they do that, where they say, well, I have this one list where everything that I post only goes out to friends, but parents are blocked. And then I have this one thing where it's only for family. And I find that very burdensome, but I really think what that's all about is them trying to hold on to the old guard, lack of context collapse, right? Okay, the other thing that I wanted to sort of like bring to your attention, and I sign this, I swear, in like every social media class I've ever taught, even my grad classes, because I love the concept so much, is this idea in the Thompson article of ambient awareness. And the reason I actually link this as something that's unique to social network sites is because if you read that article, Thompson, the author, is making an argument that ambient awareness is all about news feeds. So, and this kind of goes down to the, like, is Twitter a social network site? He would definitely argue it is, I think. So Twitter and Facebook, even, you know, anonymous sites like Yik Yak, right? They have these news feeds where you're getting this constant trickle of other people's thoughts or running commentary. And this is where, on one hand, I think social network sites get a lot of criticism, right? That's the typical, why do I care what you had for breakfast? You know, like, oh, microblogging, it's so stupid, like, who cares? Well, this article would suggest why you should care, or why it might be something different and perhaps meaningful in our lives. The idea with ambient awareness is that when you get this constant trickle of information from a person, even if it's about just stupid things like what they had for breakfast, or, you know, what they wore yesterday, or a little picture of, you know, of what's going on in their classroom at the time, or whatever, you start to develop a larger sense of them, of their routines, of who they are, right? Their person. So it's ambient awareness because it's not this direct awareness that you get from talking to them. It's just something that you sort of pick up in passing, right? That you sort of notice, but you're not even necessarily aware you notice it. In fact, one of the things that's really challenged me is I've always wanted to study ambient awareness using survey research, but I think one of the best ways to explain what ambient awareness is that feeling you get when you realize somebody hasn't been posting a lot on Twitter or whatever social network site. You're kind of like, hey, where is that person? Because you haven't realized it, but you've actually gotten used to hearing their updates, right? You've had this awareness of them, but it was so peripheral, you didn't even realize it until it was gone. And it's a frustration for me because that's a very hard thing to measure. How do you ask somebody about something that they might not even be fully aware of until it's not there anymore? Anyway, that's my problem, I guess. Anyway, read that article. It's a really short read. It goes quickly because it's well written, and it brings up a lot of interesting ideas. And I'd be curious to know if you think that this is something new we have, like a new affordance from social network sites that we didn't have before the news feed. Maybe a new way of getting to know somebody, right? Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, I totally finished the lecture and then got to the end and realized that the recording had cut off for some reason. So I'm starting over, and I'm going to be happy about it in just a second once I can wrap my head around that just happened. Whew. Okay, here we go. The good news is we are doing a transition anyway, it looks like. Okay, so I wanted to talk to you just very briefly about the studies that I assigned this week, kind of to give you a preview, but I want you to read them for yourself, obviously, so I don't want to go into too much details. What I do want to say, and we'll start off with the Dieters and Mel article, is that one of the cool things about that first article that I assigned for you is that it's an experiment. And the reason that's really important is because you'll see the headlines all the time that'll say things like, a new study came out today saying Facebook makes you lonely, or fat, or insert, you know, negative thing right there, but it could be positive too. Facebook makes everybody, you know, squeal with delight or whatever, you know. And the thing is it's a great line of research that they're doing. But if you start to like think about how they've actually come to those conclusions, usually what happens is they'll give people a survey and they'll say, oh, how much do you use Facebook? And they'll say, I use Facebook 1 billion times a week. Great. And then they'll ask another question that's saying like, how happy are you? And somebody will say, I'm uber happy. And then they'll be like, hey, look at that. Facebook equals uber happiness, which is just not necessarily wrong, but it's not necessarily right either. You may have heard this in other classes. The problem is that correlation doesn't equal causation. And if you find a correlation between Facebook use and Uber happiness, that could be, though, not because Facebook caused Uber happiness, but it could be because Uber happiness is associated with more Facebook use. So those Uber happy people like to be on Facebook more, right? You like my Facebook? Yes, this is Facebook. Or it could even be that there's a whole nother variable that just happens to make people uber happy and happens to make people use Facebook more often that isn't even being accounted for. But then it wouldn't have anything to do with those two variables. It would be some other variable that wasn't captured. If people do experiments, though, right, where they're able to establish time order, like before this happened, people were like this, but then after this happened, they were like this. And it also, for various reasons, which this isn't a methods class, so I won't bore you with, but for various reasons it can control for, we call them like extraneous variables or different things that could mess up the connection you're trying to make between two variables, like that third factor between Uber happiness and Facebook use. Experiments get rid of that. So they're able to actually tell us when something is causal, when something caused something else. And that's what this study did. So this study didn't just survey people and say, hey, how lonely are you and how much did you use Facebook? What they did was they actually assigned people to either post on Facebook just like they normally would, or they assign people to post on Facebook even more than they normally do. So they specifically said, during this week, we want you to post, and I don't remember the number, but this much more, okay? So they had these two groups that they could compare, okay? And what did they find? They found that people who were told to post more status updates actually had greater levels of social connection and reduced levels of loneliness. And that's a much stronger claim than these more correlational claims, because they actually manipulated this variable so they could see this is what the level of loneliness before, and this is their level of loneliness after, and what the only thing that changed was how often they were posting, right? So that's pretty cool. I know what you're thinking. You're like, well, of course, duh, posting status updates probably makes more people more happy because they get all this positive feedback from people, right? Mm-mm. That's what's neat about this study. I mean, besides the experiment. They actually, and you can read how they did this, they actually took into account how many likes people got on all of those extra status updates that they were doing. And they found that it didn't really affect how happy they were or how socially connected they were and lonely they were. So what this means is that even if people were just posting a lot of status updates and not getting any feedback on it, right? It's like if a tree falls in the forest. Did anybody hear it? You know, if I post a status update and did anybody post to it? Did it even exist? Even if they weren't getting any feedback on it, they were still less lonely. And so why is that? And I do like how the authors speculate about this. You know, they talk about how just the thinking about an audience, right? Just sort of thinking about the social network that you're going to be sending this status update to might be enough to make us feel less lonely. And that's really cool. And the reason I think that's particularly cool for what we're talking about today is because, again, we've always had social networks. The only thing social network sites do really differently is make all of those connections visible and make it much easier to sort of connect with those connections as a consequence. And this study might suggest that just the act of sort of thinking about those connections when we're creating content is enough to make us feel more connected. And I think that's really cool. I don't think necessarily Facebook's completely positive. I'm not one of those. But I do think this is a really interesting way to think about the ways that the social network sites are actually changing how we maybe think about and interact with our own networks. So, the last study, because this is getting so long, I'm not going to say a lot about, but it's super interesting, especially now that before the study was, after the study was published, by the way, you know, Facebook now allows you to designate somebody to take over your Facebook in the event that you would pass away. And the reason they did that is because there were so many family members who, for various reasons, wanted control of their loved one's Facebook page when they were deceased, because these pages become sites of interaction even after the person's passed away. And for some, that's positive. For others, it's negative. They're talking specifically about memorial pages that were made. This is before Facebook did that. So these aren't necessarily dead people's profiles that they're investigating in this study. They're actually investigating the different types of content that was put on memorial pages specifically made for people who were deceased. But again, I would argue that there's a lot of overlap there nowadays. So that's one of the reasons I think this is relevant. But the reason I really wanted to assign this week is because I think it's just another example that we can look at. It's like, well, in some ways, some of the things that people are doing on these social network sites, memorial pages, isn't that much different from what we were doing before when we were grieving or mourning, right? We've already mentioned this, context collapse, right? How at funerals, it used to bring, funerals are just one of those places where everybody and their mom shows up, and then they meet everybody else from your, God forbid, but one day it's all going to happen. Everybody else from your social network, right? It's just like a wedding where everybody sort of comes together, and so it facilitates interactions that maybe would not have occurred otherwise. But again, that happens offline too. The argument here is that the same thing would happen in these memorial pages, and they talk about some interesting cases. One of my favorite ones was where they found where a kid who had been the victim of a terrible accident. Some of his friends were posting and they were feeling guilty that they didn't prevent the accident. And the father, who may have never talked to the friends before, kind of came in and said, you shouldn't feel guilty about this. There was nothing you could have done. And so this context collapse actually facilitated this really nice interaction between two people from, different sides of the deceased social world to have that really nice interaction. The other cool thing I'll just mention, and then I swear I'll stop. Well, they talk about trolls. So that's interesting too, because that's a negative thing that can happen that I don't think happened as often at funerals. So now we have trolls involved with mourning. But they also talked about, on a positive note, how the family, will use likes and other things as metrics about people's condolences. It's kind of like when birthdays, how people will count how many birthday wishes that they get on their wall, or how many likes they'll get on something, right? So the idea is that these likes are sort of a metric of social support, which could be a very positive thing, or negative, depending on how you look at it, but whatever. Anyway, the only thing I want to say about this is, if you're going to be writing a report on it, or if you're studying from this, what I really want you to pay attention to is less about the specific examples of what was going on. I mean, you need to know that, but pay attention to all the different types of characteristics of social network sites that were being discussed in this article that actually affected people's behavior. What we're trying to do is, even when Facebook is dead and gone, or Yik Yak is dead and gone, trying to figure out what are the characteristics that actually made people respond this way or facilitated these interactions. So that way it's not unique to just Facebook, we could apply it to anything. So context collapse would be one. But she talks about a lot of other things at the end: persistence, scalability, searchability. There's a bunch of different features that the authors argue are responsible for sort of changing the way that people interact in times of mourning and bereavement. So, okay, I actually think that's it. God, for the second time. Ugh. Okay, now this is going to be super long, but it's a summer class though. It's fine. It's still short comparison. All right, see you later. Bye.